All right. Good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock, so I think we're going to get started. My name is Mary Collier. I'm the Professional Development Program Manager at the Ontario Museum Association, and I'm very happy to welcome you to Planning to Reopen Your Museum or Gallery, a Conversation. So this is a co-presentation of the Ontario Museum Association and the Ontario Association of Art Galleries. And I would like to start off by respectfully acknowledging that Toronto, where the OMA and OAG offices are located, has been the site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. It's the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. And today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to be able to work here in the community on this territory. So thank you all for being here today. I hope everybody is well and in good spirits and ready to have a really interesting conversation. I want to just start by making sure that everybody knows how to participate today. So you should be able to see my slides right now and hear me and see me speak. But when the conversation gets started, there won't be any slides. You'll just be able to hear and see the presenters. If you'd like to ask a question of the presenters, you can use the Q&A function, which will be at the bottom of your screen. And my colleague Alex Patton is signed in as the Ontario Museum Association, and she's on hand if you have any technical questions or anything you can contact her through the chat feature. Jessica Lucas is the Secretariat Coordinator at the Ontario Association of Art Galleries, and she'll be monitoring Q&A and we'll be sharing the questions with the speakers in the second half of the webinar. Am I loud enough for everybody? Just had a question in the chat about that. Okay, I'll try and speak up. So we will keep an eye on Q&A and try and get to as many questions as possible in the time that we have, but we do have a lot of people here today, so we'll do the best that we can. And we are recording this webinar and it'll be made available to everybody after. So today's webinar will be an hour and 15 minutes. We'll begin with a bit of an introduction, go into our discussion about approaches to reopening, followed by about 30 minutes of Q&A. And then Jessica will make some quick announcements and we'll wrap up at 11:15. So we have two speakers with us today. And each is going to speak from their institution's perspective about planning for reopening. And I just want to make clear from the get-go here that this webinar is not meant to provide a template for you to follow. But just to give you some insights into how leaders from these two organizations have approached their planning and implementation. So planning for reopening is going to look different at every different institution. And it looks different in different parts of the province as well. So it is always very important to refer to the guidance of your local public health authority when creating your own plan. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Stephen Borys is the Director and CEO of the Winnipeg Art Gallery, which was one of the first galleries in the country to reopen its doors after COVID-19 closure. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
And Cheryl Blackman is the Director of Museums and Heritage Services with the City of Toronto, which is a region that is currently still in phase 1 of the province's reopening plan. So welcome, Cheryl. So I think we're just gonna get right into it with the conversation. So yes, thanks Stephen and Cheryl for being with us today. And I just want to start by setting the scene a little bit. So if each of you could basically describe what your institution looked like before the pandemic. So before this all happened, what kind of sites did you have? What kind of programming did you do? Your staff, your visitors, that sort of thing. So maybe Stephen, you could start us off with a bit of an introduction to the Winnipeg Art Gallery.
Certainly. Hello, everyone. The Winnipeg Art Gallery is one of Canada's oldest civic art galleries, established in 1912. We have a full and part-time staff of about 90. We have an annual visitorship of usually hovering around 150,000. Robust exhibition program, event schedules, and right next to the WAG, as we speak, we're building the Inuit Art Center, which is a 50,000 square foot building, construction to be completed at the end of this summer. So a lot going on at the WAG. We have a very energized programming with the K-12 in Manitoba, in Winnipeg. We serve usually 25,000 kids a year through in-school, out-of-school, and on-site programming. And so the WAG pre and post-COVID is quite remarkable. And I guess for me, the most critical thing that has stayed with me in my thoughts and our plans and actions is, what is the role of the museum in the community today? What can we be as a safe, respectful, welcoming, accessible space? And that's actually the conversations we were having before COVID. And so in a way, having this conversation now, today in Canada and North America, with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with what's going on, I feel there's an opportunity for us, not just to rethink, but to plan and to adjust for the next stages. So it was very different pre and post COVID. Of course, we're still in this in a big way, but I can tell you this, the WAG has been able to function largely as it was before, with the exceptions, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. Cheryl, can you paint a picture of the City of Toronto museums for us?
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to everybody on the call this morning. Before COVID, like Stephen, the Toronto History Museums was a very vibrant space. We welcomed over 360,000 visitors annually, and we were really involved in making sure that our 10 living history sites that are owned and operated by the City of Toronto are moving towards our new vision, much like Stephen and his colleagues in Winnipeg, which is a vision to look at the past, the present, and the future. So we were in the process of actually rolling out a new brand identity, looking at a new mission, a new vision, a new narrative for programming, currently doing over 360 programs a year, as well as K-12 curriculum, looking at Indigenous education programming and developing those programs out as well. So as well as really moving towards a more visitor-centered approach to all of our program planning. We have about well over 160 staff in our team as well. And so we are spread geographically across 10 wards in the City of Toronto. So that gives us a tremendous opportunity to become community hubs, to be vibrant, essential parts of community. But certainly with COVID, we learned that the definition of essential is not exactly the same definition as the one that we use in museums. So the period pre-COVID was one of revitalization, reconnection to community, getting ready to be essential to community. And certainly with COVID, we have been learning what essential means through the lens of a museum operated by a government whose focus has changed entirely from any real museum business to delivering essential services during a pandemic. So that's been a very different period for all of us to kind of work our way through.
Yes, certainly. And I wonder if maybe I could ask you to continue speaking about that. So as mid-March approached, what did closure look like for the City of Toronto museums? How did that happen for you?
Right. So it was a really complicated and complex piece of machinery, I think, because we could see how our responsibility as museums was beginning to quickly shift, and how we were being contemplated as part of a machine that really serves taxpayers towards providing essential services like police, ambulance, hospital care, healthcare, that kind of thing, shelters and supports around those kinds of services. So around the 12th of March, when the province announced that we were publicly going to close all of the schools for that period around March break, we also got that message that our March break was going to be canceled. Similarly, all licensed childcare centers were canceling, community and recreation centers were canceling, libraries were shutting down, and of course our city operated museums were closing down. So in a period of about 3 hours on Friday the 13th, we shut down 10 museums simultaneously, and they have not reopened since. So really for us, the journey has been one of understanding that as city museum workers, our first priority is to deliver essential services, and that has meant for many of our colleagues being redeployed to other parts of the city to support the delivery of shelters, long-term care, and food banks, as well as also maintaining continued operations through a business continuity lens. So right now I am directly responsible for 100 staff, and we are still keeping the kind of machines of economic development and culture, which is a division that we live in, moving during COVID, while other members of the team are looking at mitigation and recovery efforts around COVID. So there's really a level of complexity that's happening simultaneously, and we're still all the while trying to think about how we're going to deliver service when we come back, as well as how we're going to stay engaged with our communities while we're away.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. Stephen, when that time in March approached, what did closure look like for the Winnipeg Art Gallery?
You know, in a way, it's a bit of a blur, those days. And Cheryl just mentioned Friday the 13th, and I can actually now walk through that day. And I guess what really, just on a human level, what really struck me was how much I was relying on my staff. And I guess I wrote this one word down in terms of, so there's leadership, and then there's compassion, and then there's communications. And those three things that day helped us greatly. I was in touch with colleagues across the country. We had heard when the national museums were closing, local museums. But the greatest strength I found was within my staff, the way we're connected to the community, and the leadership that we were required to show. And it happened quickly. And I remember the Saturday morning thinking, well, what have we done? We just closed the museum. But you know, within a few hours, staff came together, and in a way that allowed us to think about not just what the next weeks, months would look like, because at that stage we had no idea how long this was going to be. And I would say the unknowns, whether it's for operations, staff, unions, salaries, jobs, visitors, the unknowns, they're powerful. It's a powerful emotion that can really shut down our thinking. But quickly we put together a template thinking about what the WAG would look like when we reopened. And we focused on, in a very hopeful way, what was ahead. We didn't know when that would take place, but I would say day one of closure, we began day one of the reopening strategy, what the new museum looked like, what the new normal. And I guess throughout that whole dialogue, this idea, and I know we've heard it so many times, we are all in this together. We took great comfort in knowing it wasn't just this sector, that sector, this organization, this country, this city, this province. We were all in there, and that helped us understand that we could be part of the solution, part of the way through this.
Mary, if I could just add to what Stephen is saying. I love what he just said. First of all, Stephen, I love what you said, because it really does touch on the fact that empathy has become such a key driver of the work that we're doing here. And it also is a necessary component as we think about what's happening with Black Lives Matter, and as we think about how we're going to serve community better. So being able to tap into that empathy has been a really important part of this period of transitioning towards being closed, and hopefully in the next coming weeks, transitioning out of being closed. But the communications piece is also very key. And I really appreciate what Stephen said, because I think we all became whizzes in the areas of using technology and working virtually overnight, because for museums professionals, we all have heard and have told staff, you know, working from home and working remotely isn't something we're probably going to be able to do pre-COVID. We now know that that's not quite correct. So it really has been a game changer for helping us all understand that the 21st century and 21st century work, life, as well as engagement is a new and evolving journey.
Absolutely. And Stephen, you were saying that pretty much as soon as you closed, you started to think about what the reopened WAG would look like. So can you tell us a little bit about how you did approach to planning for reopening? So what did that process look like, and who was involved?
Well, it's interesting, and I say this with respect and caution, because sitting on the CMA board, being on CAMDO and AMD, these are National International Museum associations, there was, of course, the concern for the collection, the objects, the artifacts, the spaces, and that remains. But I would say we shifted the focus at the WAG to, well, what about the people? And how do we protect them, the staff, the volunteers, the community out there that rely on us, the kids, the parents for the after school programs, the K to 12. So it was tricky, but it helped us plan for that. And the planning started, first of all, as we saw what was going to be inevitable, jobs being cut, people laid off. And I made a decision that we would do our best to come up with a strategy with operations so that we could keep any layoffs to the minimum. First of all, we did have to suspend contractual staff, casual staff, which are hired every 2 weeks for programming docents, and that wasn't easy. We kept all full-time staff on. We still have today. Our part-time staff layoffs were limited to about 6. Now, how do you balance that when you were down to 0 revenue, earned revenue in April 1? We looked at what we could shift for exhibitions, programs, and events. We, of course, looked at the federal wage subsidy, other support from the Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage. But most importantly, from the day one, the human factor, the people factor was critical as much as the artifact factor. And I would say that's a balance. And I know museums, we must protect the holdings we have, whether they're historic houses, whether they're objects or spaces. But as soon as we understood that this isn't just about that, it's about the people we work with, the people outside, it helped us make decisions. And, we said, we can postpone this exhibition for a year if it saves us these jobs, or we can shift this program if it allows us to engage. And I would say at each step, our staff was involved. We have a number of labor relations committee, Health and Safety Committee, they were involved. We made sure that the decisions weren't made at an executive level. And as Cheryl points out, communications at each front, each week, because things were changing literally daily in terms of what we thought would happen. But I will say, thinking about the staff, centering them in the discussion helped greatly in planning what we were going to look like post-COVID or actually post-reopening.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Cheryl, with the City of Toronto, what did your initial conversations about reopening look like, and who was involved?
Right. So I think what's really interesting for us is that, much like Stephen, we are all moving towards a deeper appreciation and understanding of user-centered design. And I think this is something that's super important as we move through not only delivering services for visitors, but also understanding that our staff are internal customers as well, and their needs have to be centered as we move forward. And so within the city, we had 5,000, the category is rec workers, who were released as a result temporarily of COVID. And these are usually the staff who come on contractually, as well as our historic interpreters who make up, the animation of our experience on our sites. Really, really challenging time for staff to contemplate, whether they were going to be on taking advantage of CERB, whether they were going to need to take advantage of emergency leave that was being established by the city, what was going to happen in their own personal experience, while we were also thinking about what was going to happen with the future of our service and delivery to Torontonians. So for us, it was a deep period of reflecting on all of our services and literally auditing all of our services and reviewing anything that we had previously audited to just establish, which services we were going to be able to stand up and how soon after we got the go-ahead could we stand those services up. But in a government, of course, the layers of complexity are deep and they are many. And so it's not just about what the Economic Development and Culture team wants to do. It's also about what the Toronto Public Health Unit is giving us guidance to do, as well as our People and Equity team, who are really managing that human experience and staffing relationships with labor relations. So all of these groups have been on overdrive for now probably almost 12 weeks to make sure that we're being really responsible both to our staff and to the public in our planning. And it's meant that we've been, I think, communicating better than we ever have, I'll be honest. Daily staff emails from corporate, daily web calls with staff, phone calls one-to-one with staff. This has gone on now for weeks, and it continues to really keep us connected and focused on who we are serving. The why in what we're doing has become very, very clear. And so for us, really, the approach has been about looking at what we're doing, why are we doing it, and the things that we're doing, how do we do those things better? And also, how do we do those things in a way that really ensures as much as we can control during a pandemic for the safety of both staff and for the patrons who we're hoping to welcome in the coming weeks.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Cheryl, you mentioned, working within a large municipal structure. I mean, the largest city in the country is very complex, and there's a lot of layers there. I wonder if you could speak to, I guess, both the challenges of the benefits of that. But in addition, I mean, you run some very small historic sites, essentially, which, like many of our smaller members, have their own unique challenges. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
I think it's really interesting because it feels like for every challenge, there's a double-edged sword where it's equally beneficial to be in a city because we have resources. We have, deep resource knowledge. So when we need to get questions answered, the subject matter experts are right there in the city. Most of the time, it's very rare that you can't find somebody in the city who doesn't hold the answer to something that we need to resolve, which is a huge benefit. However, there's a roadmap for reopening that's set for the city. And we also have our own roadmaps in economic development and culture. So making sure that those plans all align and that we are checking off, health and safety, making sure that we're checking off PPE, making sure that we're checking off what the experience is going to be in terms of, are there enough staff to safely deliver those services? Things will take a little bit longer in a city of the size that we're working through. So, I'm a bit jealous of Stephen when he says that, he was able to start planning the reopening from the first day of being closed, because in reality for us, we haven't been able to do that. We've had to really be focused on the essential service delivery piece and have only been able to shift towards a real focus on reopening in about the last 4 weeks. Once we knew that the service delivery essential piece was under control and covered, and that staff that were part of our team were moving into roles in other parts of the city to support essential service delivery. So I think, I'm really, it's always one of those things where you kind of are balancing the feeling that sometimes there's so many steps you have to take against this desire to be more nimble. But I think ultimately you just move as fast as you can within the constraints that you have given in terms of the kind of levels of checks and balances. But it's really reassuring to know that those checks and balances exist. So even if you're a small space and a living history museum, there's so many opportunities through research to lean into, the ICOM directives, the directives from the CMA, the directives from the Association for State and Lived History. So many different people are talking about what are the opportunities, what are the things to look out for, how to maintain and manage your collections. So it's important to look at as much of that guidance as possible, and then take it away and begin to frame your own experience to make sure that you're being true to what your offer was pre-COVID. But the offer won't be the same. It will certainly be different. But at least the idea of trying to uphold your vision and mission still needs to be centered in the way that you plan your recovery.
Thank you, Cheryl. And Stephen, as you mentioned, I mean, you have been open now for probably about a month, I think, and you did obviously a lot of preparations in advance to reopen. I wonder if you could speak to kind of how prepared you felt when you opened the doors again, and then what the reality has been once people started coming back.
It's a good question, and I just have to pick up on something that Cheryl said because as she spoke, this really just hit me. This was a call to action for museums, and I sit on the Canadian Museum Association's board of the Reconciliation Council. And, we're trying to respond to the TRC's calls to action for what museums have to do and what they haven't done. And just the confluence of what's happening. Cheryl mentioned Black Lives Matter. I realized if we are going to survive, if we're going to be sustainable, useful, relevant institutions, and if we are going to continue to receive public funding at any level, we have to be relevant, impactful, responsive, and accessible. And, you know, those kind of things kept me going. And they gave my staff hope that, you know, we actually have a role to play here in reconciliation. We have a role to play in accessibility, in peace and justice. And it helped me. And so when you asked about, you know, the nuts and bolts of reopening, the reopening, I'm going to say, was actually not as hard as I thought. And I think that changes with every staff and every department and every organization. There's no question. Some have different collective agreements, different provincial protocols, health and safety. So we know that. And Manitoba, remarkably, was in a different place than Saskatchewan or Alberta or Toronto. We were fortunate in some ways. And clearly that impacted on how we could reopen. And so when the government of Manitoba made the announcement on May 1st for the first phase of opening safely, museums, galleries, and libraries were on that list. But many of my colleagues in the city did not reopen, and some remain closed. And it shows that every institution is different. But I felt what the WAG could do is play a leadership role. And I'm speaking specifically to performing arts, because we know museums and galleries, in terms of the visual arts, are in a much better place than the performing arts in terms of what is considered a reopening and seasons that will be lost. And I felt that we could actually raise the profile of the importance of art and culture in the community for sister organizations and initiatives, and for much smaller organizations that will not see a reopening anytime soon, that we could play a role. And it came down to this. I just try to keep this short. Museums and galleries hold significant square footage in our city cores. I cannot think of another public organization. You know, the WAG is, you know, it'll be 160,000 square feet. Downtown Winnipeg, and how do we make those spaces accessible? So it was not just about the collection, the exhibition, the program, or the event, but it was simply opening our doors safely, respectfully, so that people, families, individuals, seniors, students, visitors could see the WAG as a place, period. And yes, the art is there, the artifacts are there, the programming, but that they would feel comfortable, they would feel that it's their space, they would feel respected, and they would feel safe physically, intellectually, emotionally, coming into the WAG on any given day, just to hang out, to commune, to visit. And those things that kind of have guided what kind of spaces, what do we need to do with our spaces, our programming, touch screens, interactive spaces, all those things impacted. But at the core of our mission to reopen was, can we simply be a space for the community? And that means very different things. And we know for millennials, I just love this statistic, you know, something like 80% of millennials look at museums as a place to chill out. But then 75% of millennials look at the walk in a park as a cultural event. So this call to action for museums was, okay, if we're going to be relevant in a decade or even next year, we have to ensure the threshold of access is changed. And I don't mean just the dismantling of the whole pre and post-colonial structure that museums are based on. That is part of it, but I also mean to ensure that every Winnipegger, every Manitoban whose taxes go to support our program, feel that they have a piece in the real estate of the WAG. I don't know if I answered your questions, but the fundamental thing was, as we were planning, and as Cheryl said, already rethinking engagement and accessibility, and I love what you said about visitor-centered. It sounds weird because we're object museums, we're object institutions, but it's more than the object. It's got to be how that visitor accesses it and that narrative.
Yeah, if I could build on that as well. I mean, the inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility lens is ever more present and potent during COVID, I think, than it has been in any of our histories. And really, this is an opportunity. So I think, we talked about the challenges of working in a municipality and the opportunities, but COVID, it seems so almost macabre to say, but it is an opportunity, because when in our experience in our lives will the entire world stop? And when we have an opportunity to shift the offer to all the things we have held aspirationally, and restart, and in terms of rethinking what it is we bring, rethinking the way that we connect people to the things that we offer, and really this, for the next pandemic, because there will be another thing, another terrible virus in the future, how do we reset the stage now so that we're better equipped to manage through the next pandemic? I mean, ultimately, it was clear it was actually really challenging for so many staff to hear that museums weren't defined as essential in legislation, because we all deeply believe that they are. So when museums and libraries and art galleries were shut down, we were all kind of like struck, but it's tied to legislation. So the work that we do now as museums and museum leaders to help policymakers understand the essential quality of libraries, of art galleries and museums is really the work for shoring up the future. Because we do have to make sure that our relevance is tied to really being essential as we continue to evolve in the way that people think about these spaces, and the way that we use our green spaces and our interiors as really the true reflection of the agora.
Hey, thank you both for that. I want to kind of pick up on the talk about communication and all of the various different ways that people use museums and people view museums. And I wonder if you could speak to about how you've been communicating with the public about reopening, about how the new ways that people will be able to access museums. I wonder, Stephen, could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, on our side, literally 2 months before we closed, we launched a new website. And it's amazing that it was a very up-to-date tool. And so in a way, COVID was the biggest test for us. Can we use that website as a tool? Now we understood it's just part of it. But I would say communications, whether it was on the website, whether it's e-blast, whether it's text or emails, or through social media, were incredibly powerful. And maybe because the WAG was very upfront about what we didn't know, we were transparent about what was ahead, we became actually a participant in a number of local, regional, and national dialogues. And we had a lot of media outlets calling us, well, what are you doing? How is it going? What is it like? And I would say that also starts right at the top. And what I did within a week of our closure, on our website, and the whole platform for the COVID period was called WAG at Home, or Winnipeg Art Gallery at Home. And I decided to begin a daily post on my daily art. And I chose an object or an idea or an artist or an exhibition, and I started it to share the collection with audiences. But what happened, it became for me my go-to moment in the day to actually get some hope, some inspiration. And so the response from the community, I didn't even anticipate it, that they were writing back, posting, wow, of course, art connects us. Art is a tool, art is a voice. And you just have to go to any platform, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, to see how art is used for people to express themselves. And over and over, performing arts, visual arts, choirs, performances, artists at home. And we realized, well, that's part of the reason why we have been called to action here, that art will be the most critical way that we can allow people a platform. And so here we are building this Inuit Art Center. You think of it, a center dedicated to Indigenous art, which has been largely presented to the public by non-Indigenous voices up until now. And here was a chance to open, to actually let go a bit, to allow people to take some control over those voices. And I would find that the dialogue has been critical, and it's not one way, it's back and forth. And more people are relying on the WAG to share their stories. And just one little anecdote, well, not a small anecdote. Well, you know, on June 5th, when they were organizing for the Black Lives Matter event down the street from us, the organizers of Black Lives Matter called us and asked if the WAG could be a safe space for at any moment in that event and it was a confidential space that people could go to. And I realized, wow, they see us as a useful place in the community. And it's because we've been communicating that we want to be open and accessible. And it helped us understand that is part of our mission, is just offering a space to people, regardless of why they're coming through our doors. Even the art gallery as a throughway from one part to another part. It just helped my staff understand. And of course, as you're trying to protect the visitor coming back, that visitor is also the staff. So that visitor who doesn't want to come to work that day, and we deal with that. But the visitor is both the inside and the outside component. And it allowed us to think about the fears that people have, the way they wanted to help. And I would say my staff overall felt, wow, you know, we're actually playing a useful role in the community. We're doing something. We're one of the first. And it kind of inspired and it encouraged us to be stronger at that time when we couldn't really be weak if we wanted to be a useful tool.
Thanks, Boris. Go ahead, Cheryl.
No, I was just going to say, you know, I love this idea of allowing yourself to be a conduit for the community. I think it's really remarkable. And I think certainly for, you know, the City of Toronto museums, we are still shuttered, and all of our social media is also shuttered. And that part of, you know, the directive within the city has been that, you know, the channels that we do use for social, which are very well visited, have to be focused 100% on COVID. And we're only now beginning to talk about coming up from that. So, you know, Mayor Tory has been doing daily press conferences around 3:45. Those are available on YouTube. But then within the body of the city staff, there was a realization across several divisions, not just in museums, that we had content that we wanted people to take part in. And so we created on the City of Toronto website a stay and play at home section, which was our own kind of single opportunity to share experiences that were both art center, museums, parks and forestry and recreation type experiences to kind of keep people engaged. And it was also the motivator for us to accelerate the work we're doing to get our collection online. So in the next, hopefully 2 weeks, we're going to be launching part of our website, which will be able to show all 150,000 pieces of our collection to visitors online with our current provider, Monisis. So we're thrilled for the opportunity to actually, you know, lean into that Winston Churchill moment, which is never waste a good crisis, and use, you know, this crisis of COVID to really accelerate the work we had planned for later in 2020 to get our collection available and to share that online. And that means that we're going to share that collection using reference images only, no pretty high gloss anything. And it's been a source of trepidation for the staff, but we have been really assured by other colleagues who've done this work globally that, you know, it's about making sure that people, especially during these times when we're going through, you know, Black Lives Matter, what's happening within reconciliation and the Indigenous community, when folks just want to find resources, that we make our assets available as broadly as possible without fear of looking perfect. I think the kind of desire to be perfect in everything we do, hopefully is beginning to wane. And certainly through COVID, we've learned that, you know, design thinking requires us to be iterative. And that means that sometimes the thing that you put out is not perfect the first time you put it out. It may be never perfect, but it allows people to engage with it in a way that makes it feel accessible.
Thank you, Cheryl. We just have a few more minutes before we're going to open up to the Q&A, and I have a couple of final questions for both of you. And Cheryl, I know with planning for reopening, I mean, there's a lot of details that need to go into it and a lot of health and safety, and it's you know, potentially a very stressful process to be going through. But I just wonder if you could tell us, you know, what are you most looking forward to when your sites are allowed to reopen again?
The visitor. The visitor. I think, you know, for me, the visitor is everything. I used to be the assistant vice president of, you know, audience development at the ROM, and I started out there as the director of visitor experience. So that visitor experience is the raison d'etre. It's why we do this work, as far as I'm concerned, you know, and as servant leaders, we have to understand the why. The why is the visitor as much as it is the collection. And so to be able to see people coming to the site again, I can't wait. And I know, you know, I really can't wait to have staff back at the sites, because staff have been amazing. They have been simply the, you know, the heroes in this journey. And they have really been so clear about their desire to return to the work. So I want nothing more than to see staff who love museums with every part of their fiber back in the spaces that give them life. So yeah, when you bring those two things together, that's what I'm looking forward to, absolutely.
Wonderful. And Stephen, I wonder if you could speak to, I guess, what is the best part about being reopening, or what has surprised you most about your reopening process?
Well, we opened, when we opened, we dedicated the first 2 days free for all frontline workers. And we let frontline workers define who was a frontline worker. There was a government protocol, but we wanted them to feel welcome. But I remember on the second week, we were open, and I'm walking to my office inside, and I hear all these kids, and I almost lost it. I hadn't heard those voices for so long. And it kind of brought the life back to the museum. And it was that sign for me that museums, again, you know, we are about the object, but we are about the people. And what I loved popping up into the galleries, and this is really interesting, you watch that person looking at an object and you see that kind of interaction. But I loved watching people watch other people in spaces responding to objects and installations. And you felt we're part of the fabric of the community. And how can we keep that so that you have that interactivity, you have that exposure, and you have people influencing other people in a positive way. I would say the responses we're getting, if I had 2 seconds to share a tiny anecdote, and it was the week after we were open, and I had this email from a woman. She happens to be a producer at a theater company, and she said she came by. It was her first public outing, and her father had just died in a personal care home in Ontario. She couldn't go to the funeral. She couldn't see her father. She came into the WAG and just spent an hour there in contemplation, meditation, thinking, and it was what she needed. And I said, wow, okay, that's why we're here, that we're a safe space where people can gather one-on-one. And it made me realize, if the public is responding about the space and not just the show or the program or the event, I think we have a chance to be, or continue to be, relevant and impactful.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's a wonderful anecdote, and certainly motivating for why we're all excited to get back to being able to share our work with visitors. So thank you both for this conversation. I think at this point I'm going to pass it over to Jessica at OAG. She's been monitoring the Q&A, and get to some of the questions that the participants have been putting forward during this conversation.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. So our first question comes from Sarah, and it's directed at Cheryl. Sarah wants to know, are you doing time ticketing for your smaller museums? And if you know if the Ontario government stage 2 for museums require it.
So thanks for the question, Sarah. So we are planning to do time ticketing. We are still in phase 1, as most people in Ontario are aware. Hoping to have an announcement later today regarding what will happen with our reopening messages from the Premier. I haven't seen an actual requirement for time ticketing, but we took the decision to do that as a way just to do two things. One, to make sure that we know who's on our sites in the event that we have to do contact tracing, and knowing that with web ticketing, that allows us to capture contact information. It seemed like the most simple and easiest thing to do. And then two, it's also about just being able to manage the spaces and the capacity in those spaces, because our spaces are historic houses in some cases, and they are smaller, whereas in some cases like Fort York National Historic Site, which is 42 acres, it's extremely huge. So we have that kind of large spectrum in our suite of offers. So as a result, we are going to do time ticketing. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of combine two questions from the Q&A. They're both about the WAG pertaining about artists. So Liz wanted to know, she loved hearing more about the WAG making space for more accessible, like being accessible to performance artists. So she wanted to know how the WAG and Borys reached out, and kind of in connection to this, you also spoke about delaying exhibitions for a year, which has implications for artists' livelihood, as well as their own planning processes. So how are you going to address artists' needs and concerns about the future?
First of all, with our colleagues in the performing arts, what we did is we immediately offered to them the WAG space at no cost for them to, while they couldn't produce a show for 500 people, what they could do is keep their presence in the community, their profile there in our WAG spaces. So they've taken on, for instance, a trio coming in, a performance group coming in. We have this amazing 15,000 square foot rooftop sculpture garden, using that at night for some pop-up performances. The goal was that it was a chance for them to engage with their public on our space. And whether it's to do with fundraising initiatives, that we would allow that, we've done that. With regards to exhibitions being canceled, postponed, this was part of really what was a hierarchy. For me, the hierarchy was keeping our staff employed. And we gave our staff options. We realized if this show has to be postponed, it'll allow us to maintain this. If we had a contract with an artist, it was honored, and we've continued that. They've also, as we are transparent with them in terms of our operations, that, let's face it, if this continues and our audience numbers do not increase, even what we're doing now is not sustainable, and we'll have to revisit. When the wage subsidy is terminated by the federal government, that's going to impact on what we're doing if our end revenues are back up. But I would say every institution is different, and with the WAG and with living artists, we've actually either sat down with them or had Zoom calls with them to plan an exhibition. We had a big show called A Hard Birth, which is contemporary Métis art. And the two curators decided we could put this off a year. We've confirmed the dates. In other cases, we've had to rely more on the permanent collection, which is a more affordable way to produce programming, because we don't have to pay for loans, for shipping, for insurance and handling. And the good thing is, the fact that we're all in this together, if we had to cancel a show with another organization, they were in the same boat. Or if we had to postpone, there was a bit of a domino effect. And it's not as if the WAG was isolated. And we worked together on solutions in the end.
Thank you. This question is open to both of you. So building on the potential for a second wave or another pandemic, they're wondering if either director has asked or planned to ask for for feedback on senior management support of staff during the closure and reopening.
Sorry, could you just repeat that question again?
Sure, yeah. So building on the potential for a second wave or another pandemic, I'm wondering if either director have asked or plan to ask staff for feedback on senior management support of staff during the closure and reopening.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have been doing polls throughout the experience with COVID to gauge, staff feedback regarding things that we're doing, to ask, what we should or shouldn't be doing for the things that we control. And we are, as part of the reconstitution or restart plan, there's an evaluation phase. So within the evaluation phase, there will be staff surveys to ask for staff input, absolutely, because these times, as much as they are troublesome and challenging, they're also learning opportunities, and we need to really be clear that we need to learn from the good things we did as well as the things we could do better. And so the surveying will happen and is part of our plan, yes.
Yeah, and I can say for our dialogue is weekly with our Health and Safety Committee and Labor Relations Committee, and that's a committee that is shared by members of the union and members of the management. We each week are kind of reaching out to staff, because the other thing is, in order for us to stay open, we had to redeploy staff, and we created, and these are documents that, of course, as I mentioned, I'm happy to share with anyone on the webinar. Staff, each one took on a frontline shift each week. Each staff member has acted as a gallery ambassador or gallery monitor. So they're taking on roles, and that includes the management in kind of that rotation. It's allowed us, because at this moment, half of my staff is still working from home or remotely. And back to what Cheryl said about what is a new normal, there's no question we will never go back to how we operated before. And some staff, depending on their family situation, daycare situation, who's at home, the work, are actually quite happy continuing that. So it's a weekly kind of, what's the next week look like? And at times it's stressful. On the other hand, as long as the communication lines are open and the staff feel that they have a say in terms of what's best, it's actually proving to be less stressful and more constructive.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into another question, because talking about redeployment. So Kim wants to know, Cheryl, you mentioned that your staff are redeployed within the municipality. Our staff are all redeployed except for me. However, I'll be off on a paternal leave before it looks like our staff may return. What steps have you been taking so as your staff return from redeployment, they can jump back in to resume the now normal museum work without losing more time on top of what we have already lost during these last few months?
I think one of the things that I'm really contemplating for my staff is that when folks come back, they need a bit of a decompression moment, and that could be moments, it could be days, because they've been through something so unique and so life-changing. And we've heard from colleagues who've been in long-term care facilities who've written us and called us and talked to us, and we've shared those messages with all staff with their permission. It has been, for many people, life-changing work. And I personally don't have any expectation of my team members who've been redeployed jumping back in quickly. I believe that they're going to come back in at their own phase and at their own pace, because they just need to kind of reacclimate to what they've experienced and how it impacts the work that they're going to do and they had done previously. So that's the empathy piece. I just really believe that this is, being on the front lines, if you're in a long-term care facility, a shelter, it is really like nothing any of us have dealt with in our lives, especially during a pandemic. And there really just has to be some space given to people to accept that folks have gone through something that's potentially very, I think paradigm shift is not big enough. It really is life altering. And so folks they're going to have to tell us when they feel ready to just dive back in. And we have to be comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. So Shauna wants to know, it'd be great to hear about some practical strategies your organizations have considered / undertaken for reopening, i.e. cleaning schedules, admissions, considerations, floor signage, mandatory masks, etc. And also want to know from Stephen, how has attendance been since reopening? And then have people been following social distancing and one-way signage?
You know, I will say, of course, there are small museums and historic houses, but the WAG, like some civic and provincial museums, we actually, well, museums are usually good at social distancing, period, the way people engage. Now, we have a lot of square feet over 4 levels. So the signage is critical. And of course, that signage begins outside the museum, it begins online. Visitors go to our website, and we moved from WAG at Home to coming home to the WAG in terms of what you needed to do. All the government signage was there in all places. So for instance, when you come in, you are greeted by someone where you do a pre-screening questionnaire of 7 questions. We now have where you can take someone's temperature. There's the sanitation stations are everywhere, you know, plexi barriers between you and the person giving you your ticket, but then time tickets are in place now. We have staff still taking shifts for cleaning, for gallery monitoring. If people are close to each other in a gallery, the staff just let them know. And of course, decals on the floor, signage throughout. We have signage at the washrooms in terms of capacity in the elevators. And it's pretty well everywhere. Our attendance was incredibly slow. But yesterday was our first, what we call Family Sunday, which is free. And by the end of the day, we had 450 people. Now that's over the course of an 8-hour day. And of course, following government protocols, you can operate at a percentage of your overall square footage, but then within that 50% square footage, you have to have the physical distancing, but then you also have to have 1 person per every 10 square meters. So once you've done all the math, you realize that there's no one gallery space that can have more than 50 people. So it's a constant monitoring. And I will say it's demanding to maintain that. And the goal is that people also will eventually adopt how we operate, how we work. And I feel when we move through it, there'll be organizations in different sectors that don't survive. And this is the reality. Those that will survive have had to really think about how we do that and what we change and what we're willing to change to be part of that solution.
Mm.
I think, building on that, this idea of being welcoming when you're behind a mask, which is going to be a reality for many of us, it really does. It's going to take people to another place. I think it is going to be physically and emotionally draining, I think, for staff who are on the front lines. And I worked through 9/11 with the airline industry before coming to museums back in 2004. And it really did change the kind of texture of the experience in the airline industry, 9/11. And the same thing is going to happen here, where we're kind of used to in museums a very easy, relaxing welcome, and we're going to have to really, I think, amp it up a bit so that folks can feel our sincerity because we're behind a mask. And I think I won't be surprised if we move towards those transparent masks eventually, so that folks can actually see us smile, because those are the things that make the experience, that those personal contacts, those interactions, and doing them from a social distance is going to be a challenge for all of us. And to Stephen's point, I think, we're going to be thinking about what limited capacity means, how you do flow in only one direction in the case of living history sites, all in through one door, all out through one door, no crossing over of traffic. It's going to make the experience feel a little bit more regimental, I think, initially. But I do believe there will be adaptation, and I believe that staff are so good at what they do that they're still going to find ways to help visitors feel the impact of the stories that they're sharing through the engagement that they deliver.
So during the reopening stage, Elena wants to know, how likely are you or will you be relying on the volunteers, summer workers, or museum interns? Do you or will you need their assistance?
I can say for the WAG, they're critical, and that's where we've had some challenges, volunteers wanting to step forward. And while we've been in daily dialogue with our staff, it hasn't been the same with volunteers. And I realized that was one perhaps error, that because we need them just to help staff. For instance, it's not possible for our staff to continue all taking shifts in terms of gallery monitoring and ambassadors. And there's a point when every staff member needs to be shadowed or supported by a volunteer, and we're not there yet. It tells me that that is part of our responsibility in terms of engaging with the community, because if the community takes ownership of the WAG in a bigger way, I think we'll have a stronger volunteer corps. And it has been challenging because we need them, not just for frontline, for gallery monitoring, but also for, as we now build up our school programs again through day camps and summer camps, and having that ratio of parent or guardian to the group. So it's a challenge for us because we need the people, and people are still hesitant to come forward, and we have to ensure that the space is safe as it would be going to a grocery store or going to a bank or something.
But the one complexity that we have to manage, which is our demographic in our visitor volunteer group. So our volunteers in museums tend to be seniors, largely seniors, and they're at-risk groups. So, you know, the fear factor that some of those folks will feel is absolutely real. And we're going to have to manage for that, as well as managing for, you know, the feelings of our staff. But I think that the converse opportunity there is that we also need to encourage young people, youth, to get involved increasingly in our spaces. So hopefully, you know, if our more senior members of the volunteer pool are not feeling comfortable coming out in the next, you know, 6 months to a year as COVID kind of comes to a manageable place in our lives, hopefully we'll be able to engage interns and other student body volunteers to join the kind of the fight of delivering visitor experiences during COVID, because ultimately we don't need young people just for now, we need them for the future. So getting those communities activated is really something we need to think about how we're going to do.
Kind of following up with volunteers, there's a question of what are the moral implications of relying on volunteers? Many of our volunteers are vulnerable sector.
I think the moral implication is the same as it is for anybody that we're working with. You know, we have our first obligation is to the health and safety of the people that we have on our sites, our staff, our volunteers, our visitors. The obligation is the same. Health and safety, you know, should be everyone's number one priority. You know, it's like being in an airplane and a plane is going down. You put the mask on yourself first before you put the mask on somebody else. Same analogy here. We got to make sure that each individual person is taking care of themselves, and that we as leaders in spaces are ensuring that the climate is situated in such a way that, you know, safety is our number one priority beyond everything else that we do.
And I would add to that. I recall I was having a board executive meeting the day before we were announcing our reopening, and one of my board members, who's an attorney, says, "Well, is your liability insurance going to cover someone if they contract COVID?" And I just about lost it. And I realized the only hope I found was we're in this together, and if people understand there's a whole nother level of liability. However, there's also a whole nother level of responsibility for all of us in what we do and how we act and how we prepare our spaces. You know, if someone trips on a rug in a gallery space, they could sue the WAG, it's true, and we have insurance. But there's a point when the more we can be transparent in terms of what we're really able to do and what we want to offer. We wanted to offer people a space. We knew there were going to be risks. We've done everything we can following government protocols and guidelines to be as safe as we can be at this moment. Still, there are risks, but we had to weigh those every day. And back to the board member, I think he understood that what I'm facing is trying to keep staff employed, trying to keep the community engaged, knowing there's going to be risks. And there's risks pre and post COVID.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Eileen Davila in Toronto has said very clearly, we're all trying to figure out ways to live with COVID now, because we're going to be in this space for some time. We don't know how long. And we understand the implications for a shutdown economy. So we do need to begin to transition ourselves at a slow and cautious pace, using the best guidance and following the frameworks that are established for us, to kind of go back to a new normal, a next normal. But there is, I think at this point, there's no scenario where we can guarantee 100% that no one's going to have an issue with COVID once they go back to the workplace. We wish we could, but there is no scenario that exists.
Mm. So we have a couple questions about related to kind of touring visitors and things. So the first question is, how would institutions be able to do things like touring visitors? And a question for Cheryl specifically is, do each of your small house museums depend on guides? Are there any of them self-guided spaces? Have you given any thought to transitioning these spaces to self-guided spaces? So kind of this question of how would touring visitors go and guides?
Yeah, it's funny. So we are talking through that right now, because our first phased opening will be Camp TO. So Camp TO is our summer camp program that we're doing in partnership with Parks and Forestry and Recreation. 40,000 participants benefit from that every summer. And we're going to be delivering Camp TO at 6 of our sites and 1 art center. So this is something that we're talking through right now. And, we are watching the guidelines evolve daily. And we're trying to figure out what the visitor experience will be. And in fact, when this call is over, I'm leaving to go to another call where we're actually going to be brainstorming that very question. What is the visitor experience going to be this summer? So we've done staycation experiences in our last season of programming. So I think we're going to lean very heavily into staycation kind of themes, but we are kind of trying to figure out how will a tour work effectively when each participant is 2 meters apart, or will it be self-guided? We're still trying to figure that out. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't end up with a hybrid.
Mm. Say, Stephen, is the WAG doing any touring visitors or guides? How's that looking there?
We're following the government guidelines. For instance, right now our summer and day camps are sold out, but we're following what is the day school template, how many kids you can have. And at first it was 8 kids, and the physical distancing continues. In terms of, we've had we're now starting beyond self-guided tours, online tours, in-person tours, following the same protocols where you maintain those distancing, and there's only infrequent opportunities that you would come close. It's going to be a hybrid. We have to rethink what we did and what's going to work now, and it involves actually a lot of conversations with our stakeholders. For instance, I have a 15-year-old son, and what would take it for him to come into the WAG and hang out with his friends? What does he want? And they just want a space. And I could count on one hand a month ago where kids could go and hang out and feel good, and it wouldn't cost them a lot, and it wasn't outdoors. So there's the outdoor spaces. And I figured, wow, why can't the WAG be a better space for the 15-year-old or someone living downtown? And I think largely we were talking to parents who live in high rises, who are just dying to get out into a different space with their kids. What can we do? And more, it's rethinking how people use our spaces. And our rooftop, which is outdoors, a lot of parents were happy to come in, but they wanted an outdoor space. And so we have an outdoor where we've set up with AstroTurf, croquet, bocce, doing things that are safe, that are fun. The finding for us is, as we lower the threshold, people take ownership of spaces that people have walked by the WAG for years and never felt it's their space. They would want to come in. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel respected. Now's our chance. And it is a bit of I think Cheryl mentioned, it's a bit of a marketing opportunity for museums to finally be truly accessible in the community, which they really aren't.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad, because the next question I have is kind of a bigger picture question. And I think it's post-COVID is a great time to really rework our mandates and who we're serving and all of that. So Alka brought up a good question of many museums around the world are thinking about how they can change their vision or mission to reflect post-COVID realities such as Black Lives Matter and climate change. Will your museums deal with these questions, and how will this affect how you present yourselves?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't mean to be kind of fast or flippant in my response, but I think, pre-COVID, we were already in this conversation at Toronto History Museums about, who we are, our mission, our vision, our narrative, and our narrative that we're going to be leaning into, if I can, to share with you, is that Toronto's many past, presents, and futures meet at our museums. The histories you'll experience here are not tales penned by a select few. They are stories written and told by the many who shape them. They are as diverse as the perspectives and experiences of our people, and we are many. See amazing and appalling objects, taste sweet and bitter flavors, hear laughter and lament, touch the silky and the prickly edges of our history, meet us at the intersection of our countless viewpoints, leave us inspired about this place we call Toronto. That's our new narrative pre-COVID. So the objective of that narrative was to lean into this realization that, we have to be spaces that are for everybody, that we have to become a place where each time you engage with us, you fall in love with Toronto over and over again, because you are the people who shape a city, whether it be visitor or local. And really, we want to be leading centers of experiences for critical dialogue about Toronto's past, present, and future. So within that kind of trifecta, realizing that we have to talk about, museums are not neutral. We have to just kind of confront the reality that museums and art galleries are not neutral. And as a result of that, we are going to need to take positions for social justice, and this is the time to do it.
And if I could add to that, when you introduced us as leaders. And I do believe the leaders of museums and galleries today have a critical role to play in actually pushing those agendas. And we know, Pew Charitable Trust every year, I think it's up to 850 million people in the United States go to museums every year. And that's more than all theme park attendance and major professional sporting events combined. So can you imagine 1 billion people in North America going to museums, the opportunity we have? And I would say this to every museum director or leader or curator: everyone has a chance to build a new museum, and it doesn't always have to be bricks and mortar. And this is a chance for us, and not at the expense of the performing arts or the recreational or the sporting industry. But you know what? Museums have no choice but to be more responsible if we're going to survive. And there's a chance, there's a call to action, and I'm actually really encouraged, I'm hopeful that the public will embrace what we are trying to do here, and they'll support us in that next phase.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is the time. There will, in our lifetime, God willing, there will not be another COVID, but this is a time. All of the things that we have said about why we can't change, as far as I'm concerned, they're gone. COVID has demonstrated quite clearly that the biggest barrier to everything we've ever wanted to do is our own attitude. And the entire world figured out how to take care of human beings overnight. And that was a paradigm shift of attitude. It wasn't about magic. So I think we now need to lean into this new understanding that the only barrier that we have to change is our own attitude, and really capitalize on making museums what they need to be for society.
Agreed. So I do have to wrap up the Q&A, unfortunately, but I'm glad we left off on that note of this attitude change, and that, because you're right, we were able to change this overnight, and it's totally that attitude shift. So I'm very excited, which is strange to say, but I'm very excited to see museums and galleries, how they open and how they are welcoming in these new spaces post-COVID. So I'm going to wrap up, but first I want to thank you so much, Cheryl and Stephen, for sharing your insights with today. There was so much in what you discussed that will help others to consider as they refine their own reopening plans in the coming weeks and months. Mary mentioned this in the beginning of the session, that planning for reopening is going to look different at different institutions and in different parts of the province. So it's very important and very essential to always refer to the most current guidance from the province and from your local public health authority when creating and refining your own plan. So I just want to take this time again to thank everyone who signed in for your participation. The recording will be available shortly. Before you run off, I do just want to give a few updates about what the OMA and OEG are working on. So the OMA and OEG are working on more webinars in the coming weeks, so please keep an eye on our website and social media for more information. Upcoming OMA programming, so the OMA will be holding their next hashtag Museums Connect Ontario member check-in on Wednesday at 10 a.m. It'll be a chance for OMA members to get a bit of an update and to have an informal discussion with each other about the things that are on your minds. The registration link for that meeting is on the OMA website calendar. OEG has been spearheading the movement of the public art gallery sector towards a digital ecosystem, and where we've been working on multiple innovative digital data projects. So to help your gallery prepare for the sector for data-based decision-making. So our upcoming event is the 2-day digital data mixer. You can begin to unlock the potential of your data at this event. It's an opportunity to come together and learn from case study presentations by arts and culture data experts to explore practice techniques and opportunities through facilitated peer discussion. More information about how to register is available at our website, response.oeg.org. We also do have a reopening guideline as well that we're working on, and is posted so far what we have at this website as well. So, so we've also, to further these conversations about data and the digital, when you leave the webinar, there is a short evaluation form where you can let us know how we did today and what you would like to see more of. We also do have a few questions about understanding your data and digitalization. So your responses to these questions will be very helpful to OEG and also the OMA. As you know, this webinar was offered free of charge as a service to the community during what are very challenging times for everyone as organizations and individuals. If you are able, these are some things that you can do to help support OEG and the OMA to continue to provide timely and accessible resources. If you're already a member, please renew your membership when you receive an email reminder. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one, either as an institution or as an individual. You can find information about membership categories and benefits on both of our websites, or consider making a donation to OEG or the OMA, which you can also do through our websites. Your support of our associations and your participation in events like this webinar make us stronger as a sector, so we really appreciate each and every one of you. The next slide shows the OEG COVID-19 response website at response.oeg.org. It's where you can find the most up-to-date relevant news and resources to help the public art sector through the COVID crisis. I mentioned briefly earlier, we do have a reopening document started there. The slide I have up now is the OMA's homepage, where you can click on COVID-19 resources to access their dedicated webpage, which is updated regularly with new resources for museums as they become available. And on that final note, I know I went a bit over time, so once again, thank you so much for everyone participating today. Please do stay in touch. Our contact information is available here and on our websites. And again, thank you so much to Stephen and Cheryl, and for all of you for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.